Good night, Horror Stories. My name is Richard, and I want to share an experience I had in New York City. I was returning home after a day of work on the subway. I'm a street vendor, and I don't remember the exact time, but it was around 10 at night, which is when I usually return. This happened a little over a year ago, and honestly, it took me a while to get back on the bandwagon. The subway itself is scary, especially at night, which is when I usually travel. I usually finish work after 10 p.m. and at that time it is usually half empty, but that night it was emptier than usual. This paranormal experience really left a mark on me, and I doubt I will ever forget it. As I approached the subway train to board, I watched as everyone else exited the train, leaving me alone. In the car there was only a woman sitting with her little daughter and me. That night, as the subway train moved through the underground tunnels, I became increasingly uncomfortable. The lack of passengers and the constant hum of the rails created an atmosphere of palpable tension. My thoughts grew darker with each passing moment, and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Everything seemed normal until, at the next station, the subway stopped abruptly and suddenly the car was plunged into total darkness. The lights flickered for a moment and then went out completely, enveloping us in total darkness, and I was left in limbo, a little afraid of what was happening around me. The silence was deafening, broken only by the distant sound of my heartbeat and my labored breathing. I tried to remember emergency procedures, but panic clouded my mind. I tried to stay calm until, after what seemed like an eternity, the light returned to its normal state. A woman dressed entirely in black boarded. He was wearing some kind of robe and oversized sunglasses, which caught my attention, especially since it was already night and he looked like he had just come from a funeral. She sat right across from the woman who was with her daughter. The girl started waving and smiling, showing her plush toy in the direction of the woman in black, but she remained unmoved. As the mother asked her daughter to behave and stay still, reassuring her that the woman wasn't going to play with her. But the girl continued playing from her seat, waving her plush toy and laughing. Her mother asked her to calm down upon realizing that the woman wasn't well, and understood that she shouldn't disturb her. The woman showed no expression on her face, so the mother eventually said to Jennifer, "Stay still and don't bother the woman." Jennifer responded, saying that the boy had asked her for the plush toy to play with, and she was showing it to him. Confused, the mother asked which boy since there was no one else there. At that moment, the girl pointed to the woman in black who had just boarded the subway and said, "Yes, Mom," the boy sitting next to his mother. The woman, turning to the girl for the first time, began to cry inconsolably. Jennifer's mother, surprised, asked if she was okay, handed her a paper napkin to wipe away her tears, and insisted if she needed help. The woman in black sighed, stayed silent for a few seconds, and pulled out what appeared to be a photo of a young boy from her bag, then asked if she was referring to him. The girl nodded in response and continued playing. At that moment, she told them that she had just buried her son, and that thanks to the girl, she knew that he was with her at that moment, accompanying her. The woman was stunned, watching her daughter continue to play and smile while the woman in black cried inconsolably. At the next stop, she picked up her daughter, and they got off. After that strange encounter on the subway, the woman and her daughter quickly walked away at the next stop. I was perplexed by what I had just witnessed and felt deeply moved by that woman's experience. Meanwhile, the subway car returned to its usual routine. I shared 2 more stops with the woman in black, who was still crying and smiling at the same time. Not know what to do. I wasn't supposed to have heard anything. The situation became somewhat awkward and I was in shock. As I got up to get off at the next stop, I looked over at her and saw her talking and crying. I assumed she was communicating with her son now that she knew he was there by her side. I stood watching her as the subway pulled away, watching as the woman talked, smiled, and cried at the same time in her seat, her gaze down at the seat next to her. At that moment, I felt a chill run through my entire body, like never before. The story of that woman and her connection to her deceased son left me reflecting on the idea that perhaps there are forces or energies beyond our understanding that manifest in ways we cannot easily explain and that children can experience with them. Total naturalness. Since then, every time I take the subway at night, I can't help but remember that disturbing encounter and wonder about the mysteries that can hide in the shadows of this great city. The city that never sleeps. If you have enjoyed this story, we invite you to subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss any others. Until next time. Hello, horror stories. I prefer to keep my name anonymous. I have decided to share this paranormal experience because I have realized that I am not the only person who has experienced these types of terrifying experiences, and hearing other stories makes me feel in company. This happened a little over 2 years ago. I live in San Francisco, United States. One night I took the subway back home like every day. I remember that there were very few people that night. Normally I come home earlier, but that day, after work, I stayed with some colleagues in a bar having a few beers. I went to the last car and sat down. 3 seats away there was a man lying down, an old man of about 85 years old. He was asleep and seemed friendly, but his clothes caught my attention. Despite it being autumn, he was wearing winter clothes. I assumed that because of his age he was warmer than usual. When the subway started moving, the man woke up, looked at me and asked, "Do you know where we are, son?" To which I replied that we were on the K Ingleside line, the light blue one. Then I asked him where he was going. He said he was a little disoriented, that he didn't remember his destination. I assured him not to worry, that there were 3 more stops to mine, and that we could get off together and look for subway personnel to assist him and help him get home. He looked at me and thanked me, mentioning that he had no family, but he did have a home that he wanted to reach as soon as possible, where his dog, his faithful companion, was waiting for him. He lay down, closed his eyes, and fell asleep again. I was really worried about his age and the fact that he had no family. Finally, my stop came, where I had to get off. I woke the man up and informed him that we had arrived, but there was no reaction. He didn't wake up. At the same time, the subway doors closed and I couldn't get off, but that didn't matter to me anymore. I gently moved him from side to side and spoke loudly to him, but there was no response. After a few minutes, I started to panic. I started shaking him harder and screaming for help. Some people on the train came up and asked me what was wrong with the man. I told them that I didn't know, that I had just met him and he had fallen asleep, but he didn't wake up. Then, a person dressed as a nurse approached, took the man's pulse, looked at me and confirmed that he was dead and had been like that for several hours. I told him it couldn't be, that I had just spoken to him a few stops ago. The nurse looked at me like what I was saying was crazy. However, he assured me that the man was cold and pale, clear signs that he had been dead for several hours. At that moment, someone, I don't know who, called the emergency services, and at the next stop, the paramedics were already waiting for us. They asked us all to get off the subway. They placed the man on a stretcher and took his pulse, confirming his death. There was nothing else to do. Confused and unable to understand what was happening, I watched in disbelief as the paramedics continued their emergency procedures. Despite the confusion that overwhelmed me, I stayed close to the old man, unable to look away from his lifeless face. As the minutes passed, a feeling of heaviness and bewilderment washed over me. I felt like I was trapped in the midst of a surreal nightmare, unable to grasp the reality of what was happening around me. When I noticed the presence of a coroner amidst all the chaos, I once again asked how long the deceased elderly man had been dead. I persisted because I couldn't comprehend it and feared that no one would believe that I had just spoken to him a few stops ago. The coroner informed me that the man had been dead for at least 12 hours and that he had likely spent the entire night in the subway car seats. He also mentioned that they were investigating the incident because no station guard had reported anything when they closed. I left the station pale and deeply affected by the conversation I'd had with him, now lifeless. I tried to find answers in my head, but each attempt only generated more uncertainty. I decided to go home and try to leave behind that macabre encounter in the subway. However, the feeling of unease followed me all the way, as if an invisible shadow were lurking from the depths of the underground. My nights were plagued with nightmares and obsessive thoughts for a long time. I would wake up several times during the night, knowing that there is something beyond between life and death. If you enjoyed the story, click like. It's just to know if you enjoyed it, or perhaps to let me know if you've also experienced paranormal activities.